I'm going to tell you something that most people who weren't there don't quite understand yet. It wasn't just about the fight. I know that's what everyone remembers. That's what the clips show, the ones that went everywhere across the relay networks, the short versions, the versions without context, the ones where people zoom in on his face and replay it over and over because they can't quite believe what they're seeing. And yeah, okay, that part was something else. I won't pretend it wasn't. But the part that stays with me, the part I still think about when I'm lying awake in my bunk, and the station hums around me like a living thing, isn't the moment everyone replays. It's the 10 minutes before. It's the way he was just sitting there, eating a protein block, not talking to anyone. Station lights overhead. Coffee, real coffee, the synthetic kind that still somehow smells right, going cold in the cup next to his tray. Boot on the table, which the sergeant had already yelled at him about twice that week. Just sitting there, reading something on his data pad like a man with absolutely nowhere to be. And then the alert came through. And he put down his data pad, finished his coffee, finished it. I'm telling you, the whole cup, slow, stood up, nodded at nobody in particular, and walked out. Didn't run, just walked. That's the part that nobody talks about. That's the part you need to understand before anything else in this account makes sense. Because what happened in the next 20 minutes wasn't an accident. It wasn't luck. It wasn't some random surge of adrenaline that made a small human do something that defied physics and probability and about 14 intergalactic treaties. It was exactly who he was. Every single day. We just hadn't been watching closely enough to notice. Part 1, The Station and the Warlord. Chapter 1, What Tethys 9 was. You have to understand the geography of it first. Not just the physical geography, though that matters too, but the political geography. The kind of geography that doesn't show up on nav charts, but shapes absolutely everything that happens inside a place. Tethys 9 was a neutral way station. That was its official designation. What that meant in practice was that it was crammed into the outer rim of a contested star corridor, where 6 different factions all had competing territorial claims. And the only reason any of them tolerated a united Earth presence there was because nobody could agree on whose flag should go up instead. Earth had been operating in that corridor for about 11 years at that point. Long enough to be a fixture. Not long enough to be respected, at least not by the powers that showed up occasionally to remind everyone that humanity was, in the cosmic scale of things, very new to all of this. The station itself was about the size of a mid-range terrestrial city. Roughly 90,000 people, give or take, depending on the cycle. Humans were maybe 30% of that population. UEDC personnel, civilian contractors, researchers, a few families who'd come out with one parent or another and decided to stay. The rest were a spread of about 40 different species, everything from the soft-voiced Marathi Merchant Guild to the 12-foot Dren Labor Corps who kept the heavy infrastructure running. It was not, by any serious definition, a military installation. Oh, there were UEDC soldiers there. There were always some. A garrison unit rotated every 8 months. A few specialized personnel, Signals Corps, Medical Division, Xenobiological Research staff. Some weapons systems on the outer hull, mostly defensive, the kind of thing you'd have on a station that needed to say, "We are not entirely helpless," without actively provoking anyone. But nobody was under any illusion that Tethys 9 was a fortress, which made it a very interesting choice for what happened next. Chapter 2, The Vorganthi Fleet's Arrival. From the official UEDC Incident Report, Section 2.1. Filed by LT, Commander Saoirse Mbeki Harrington, Station Commander. The Vorganthi fleet arrived in the Tethys corridor at approximately 600 station time on what would later be designated Incident Day. Their arrival was not announced. It did not follow standard neutral zone communication protocols. There was no identifying transponder signal for the first 6 minutes after they dropped out of fold space, which is itself a violation of at least 3 intergalactic navigation codes. There were 7 ships. The flagship, designated in Vorganthi military registry as the Gravith, which translates approximately as the weight of consequence, was the largest vessel that had ever entered the Tethys corridor. It was, by our sensor measurements, 4.2 kilometers long. Its weapons profile alone was enough to make our tactical officer go very quiet for a moment before he turned around and said something that I'll leave out of the official record. Supreme Warlord Drathek Vorgon led the fleet personally. I want to be careful here because I don't want to editorialize in what's supposed to be a factual account. But I also feel that pure facts, without context, sometimes fail to convey what it was actually like to be in that moment. So let me say this. Drathek Vorgon was not the kind of figure who required introduction. In the 37 years since he'd consolidated military control over the Vorganthi Directorate, he had personally overseen the absorption of 14 star systems. 2 of those had been inhabited. 1 of those had resisted. They don't resist anymore. He arrived, his fleet in formation around him, and he requested is a generous word. The message came in on emergency broadcast, which cuts through everything, an immediate meeting with whoever was in charge. I told him I was in charge. He told me that he wasn't interested in speaking with a mid-rank administrator. I told him I was the station commander. He asked me how many ships I had. I told him 14, including 4 gunships rated for active combat. He didn't respond to that directly. What he said, and I'm reading from the transmission log here because I want to get this exact. We require unimpeded access to Tethys 9 docking facilities and full cooperation with Directorate operations in this corridor. This is not a negotiation. I told him that access requests needed to go through the Neutral Zone Commission, as per the Oretha's Accords of 2187, and that I would be happy to facilitate communication with the Commission if he'd like to. He'd already cut the channel. They started moving toward the station 8 minutes later. Chapter 3, Private Calder. Witness account, Ensign Dara Okonkwo Walsh. Recorded 4 days post-incident. Location, UEDC Medical Bay, Tethys 9. His name was Marcus Calder. Private First Class, UEDC Garrison Unit, 3rd Rotation. He'd been on Tethys 9 for about 6 months when this happened, which put him somewhere in the middle of his tour. Not the newest guy, not the most experienced. He was 26 years old. He was from a place called Rotherham in northern England, which, I've been there on a layover once during a stopover on the way to the Malta orbital shuttle, is a very ordinary place. Industrial, practical. The kind of town that produces people who are very good at doing necessary things without a lot of fuss about it. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. I mention that because the Vorganthi are, on average, between 9 and 11 feet. Their battle infantry, the ones who lead boarding actions and ground operations, are specifically recruited for size and structural density. Their standard military armor, which they call Grathkel, adds another 6 to 8 inches in height and is rated to absorb weapons fire that would punch through our best composite plate like a spoon through warm soup. I'm not telling you this to make what happened seem more dramatic. I'm telling you this because when people see the clips and react the way they do, I want them to understand that their reaction isn't wrong. That their brain's insistence that what they're seeing doesn't make physical sense is, in fact, the correct response, because it almost doesn't. Marcus was not a physically exceptional human. He was solidly built. Sure, garrison duty in low to moderate gravity tends to do that, but he wasn't the biggest guy in our unit, wasn't the fastest, wasn't the one who consistently topped the combat training scores. He was reliably in the upper third. Consistent. The kind of soldier you want covering your side because you know he'll be there, not because he's going to do something spectacular. He had a habit of reading old novels on his data pad. Not digital reprints of new stuff, actual old novels, things written centuries back. He read them slowly like he was tasting them. I asked him once why he bothered when there was so much new content available. He looked at me like I'd said something slightly stupid and said, because old stuff had to survive. If it's still around, it meant something. That was Marcus Calder. At 7:41, 2 Vorganthi boarding vessels detached from the Gravith and made direct approach to docking Ring C station control, transmitted 7 denial signals. All were ignored. The boarding vessels docked without authorization at 7:49. Vorganthi boarding party, as observed by dock security cameras. 42 soldiers in full Grathkel combat armor, 6 officers in command-grade regalia, and Supreme Warlord Drathek Vorgon himself, flanked by a personal honor guard of 8. E-first checkpoint. Junction 7, docking Ring C inner corridor. Standard position for security on an unauthorized boarding. You meet them at the first pinch point after the dock, you state your position, you attempt to establish dialogue, and you wait for the diplomats to figure it out. Standard procedure. Not glamorous. We'd done variations of it before, usually with smaller parties, usually with factions that weren't quite so, I'll use the word committed to their own authority. There were 4 of us at that checkpoint. Me, Martinez, Osai, and Calder. I'll be honest with you. When those doors slid open and I saw what was on the other side, my first instinct was to step back, not run. I want to be clear about that. I'm a security officer with 14 years of experience and I don't run. But I felt the weight of that moment in my chest in a way that was purely physical, like the air pressure changed. Like something ancient in the back of my brain that predates language and reason looked at what was coming through those doors and said, very quietly, that is a problem. They were, I don't know if I can adequately describe it. In the clips you lose scale. You see them and they look big, but your brain doesn't have good reference points. In person, with nothing but a standard human corridor around them, with the overhead lights reflecting off their armor, with the sound of their footsteps reverberating through the deck plating, it's different. Warlord Vorgan stopped about 4 meters from our checkpoint line. His honor guard fanned out around him in a practiced formation. The rest of his soldiers filled the corridor behind him like a wall. He looked at us. He looked at us the way you look at things you haven't quite decided to notice yet. Sort of a dismissive scan. The 4 of us, in our standard UEDC security blues, with our sidearms and our barrier shields and our absolutely inadequate body armor. We were, I think, approximately as threatening to him as a potted plant would be. He said something in Vorganthi. I have a functional understanding of the language from my posting briefing, and what he said was approximately, "Move aside or be moved." I activated my translator comm, which takes about 2 seconds to initialize, and started to say, I had a whole speech prepared, the standard access denial protocol with the relevant treaty citations. And he'd already taken another step forward, and his honor guard had moved with him, and Martinez, who was on my left, had gone very still in the way that means a person has stopped breathing properly. And then Calder stepped forward. Just stepped forward, out from our line, into the space between us and them. And he said clearly, no translator needed in English, which I think was a choice. Sir, you need to stop. I don't think I'll ever fully describe what it was like to hear those 4 words in that moment, in that corridor, with those people on the other side of it. The Warlord stopped, not because of any tactical calculation. I think, and the people who have analyzed this footage endlessly since then have said similar things, I think he stopped because he was genuinely, briefly confused. Because no one did that. No one in 37 years had just stepped forward into his path and told him to stop. And the confusion on his face, which was visible on the cameras, which is why everyone could see it afterward, lasted about 3 seconds. The laugh is also significant in Vorganthi cultural context. A Vorganthi warlord does not laugh in a tactical situation unless they feel entirely, completely safe. The laugh is an expression of dominance. It communicates to everyone present that the laughing party sees no threat, perceives no danger, and is not even slightly adjusting their assessment of the situation. This context makes what happened next even more notable. Chapter 7, What Calder Said. Witness account, Ensign Dara Akonkwo Walsh. I wasn't at the checkpoint. I was in secondary staging. We'd been called up when the alert went out, and I was positioned down the corridor, maybe 50 meters back with a secondary response team. So I have a slightly different angle on this than Tam does. What I remember, and I've gone back and watched the footage so many times that my memories and the footage have sort of merged at this point. It's hard to separate what I saw in the moment from what I've seen since. What I remember is the sound of that laugh echoing in the corridor. Because sound carries differently in Tethys corridors. They're built with certain acoustic properties for safety reasons, something to do with being able to hear emergency signals from any position. So that laugh, and I'm telling you, it was not a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room, that takes up physical space. That laugh came down the corridor toward us like a wave. And I watched Calder just stand there in it. Not flinching, not stepping back. Just standing there, this very ordinary-sized human being in standard-issue security blues, with the largest collection of heavily armed alien military personnel any of us had ever seen in person filling the corridor in front of him, and that laugh washing over him like a tide. And when it stopped, he spoke again. I've had people ask me what he said. The footage has it. You can read the transcript. But there's something about the way he said it that doesn't entirely come through in the text, so I want to try to describe it. He didn't shout. He didn't do the thing where you try to make yourself bigger, project more authority, fill more space. He said it the same way he said everything, level, direct, like someone stating a fact that doesn't require any particular emphasis because it's simply true. He said, "I heard you the first time, but this is a neutral station, operating under the Oretha's Accords, and you don't have authorization to be past this checkpoint. So what I need you to do right now is stop moving, state your purpose, and wait for this to go through the proper channels. I'll stand here until that happens." Beat. Sir. The sir at the end was the thing that got me. In isolation, it might read as deference. In context, with everything before it, it read as something else entirely. Like he was making absolutely clear that he was aware of the power differential, and had simply decided it was not relevant to the current situation. The corridor was quiet for a moment, and then the Warlord spoke in Vorganthy, and then apparently decided Calder deserved a translation, which is something I've never heard him do based on all subsequent accounts, and said, "You understand what I am?" And Calder said, "Yes, sir, you're a person who needs to stop moving." Chapter 8, The Honor Guard's Response. From the Field Notes of Xenobiological Liaison Officer, Dr. Preet Anand Sharma. Present at Secondary Position, Junction 7 Staging Air. I've been studying interspecies behavioral dynamics for 22 years. I want to be careful about overinterpreting what I observed, because I'm aware that my professional perspective shapes how I see these things, and I don't want to editorialize beyond what the data supports. That said, I want to note something about the Honor Guard's response in the approximately 90 seconds following Private Calder's second statement, because I think it's significant and hasn't been widely discussed in the coverage. The Honor Guard shifted. It was subtle. If you weren't watching them specifically, if your eyes were on the Warlord, which they naturally would be, you'd miss it. But I was watching them, partly out of professional habit, and partly because I'd learned early in my career that in high-tension interspecies interactions, the people immediately around the primary power figure often tell you more about the situation than the primary figure themselves. They shifted, changed their weight distribution, exchanged a look, just a brief one, the kind of look that's been practiced until it communicates entire paragraphs in a fraction of a second. I've spent a long time since that day trying to accurately characterize what I saw in that look. My best professional assessment, it was reassessment. Not alarm, not discomfort, not admiration, those came later from some of them. This was the more primal version, the one that happens before you have time to form any of those more refined responses. It was the look that says, "This is different from what I expected." And in Vorganthy military culture, in any military culture, really, but Vorganthy especially, where the entire social structure is organized around the clear and predictable hierarchy of force, difference from expectation is extremely significant. Because the Honor Guard knew something that everyone watching was about to find out. They'd been in that corridor with their Warlord before, many times, in many places, and they knew, with a precision born of long experience, exactly how long it took him to get bored of a confrontation and end it. And he hadn't ended this one yet. He was still looking at this small human. Still looking. Part 3, Escalation. Chapter 9, 7 minutes. Witness account, Chief Petty Officer Tam Rezo Duya. He stood there for 7 minutes. I know that doesn't sound like a long time. In most contexts, 7 minutes is nothing. It's the time it takes to make a cup of coffee, it's 2 pop songs, it's barely long enough to notice. But in a standoff situation, with a Vorganthy invasion fleet parked 3 kilometers off the station hull and a boarding party filling the corridor in front of you, in that context, 7 minutes is immense. It stretches. Every second has weight. And Calder stood there for all of it. Didn't move, didn't shift his weight the way you do when you're getting tired. Didn't check his comm, didn't look back at us for reassurance, didn't do any of the small, nervous things that humans do when they're frightened and trying not to show it. He just stood there and he looked at Vorgon and he waited. Vorgon, for his part, seemed genuinely uncertain what to do. I've been trying to think of how to say this in a way that's accurate. It wasn't that he was afraid of Calder. He wasn't. Not yet. Drathek Vorgon in that moment could have ended Marcus Calder with about the same effort it would take me to swat a fly, and we all knew it, and Calder absolutely knew it too. It was more like he'd encountered something his operating model didn't have a slot for. 37 years of conquest, of absolute authority, of being the most powerful thing in every room he'd ever entered. None of that had equipped him for a 5'10" human from northern England who was just going to stand there and wait. He tried the obvious things first. He took a step forward. Calder didn't move. He repeated his demand louder. Calder said calmly, "I understand, and I'm asking you to wait for proper clearance." He brought his honor guard to a more active posture, the full forward lean, weapons half raised, which in Vorganthi tactical body language is the last communicative step before actual engagement. Calder looked at the weapons, looked up at the guard, looked back at Vorgon, and said, "That's not going to change my answer, sir." I think that was the moment. If I had to pin it down to one thing, one sentence, one breath, I think that was the moment where everything shifted. Because he'd looked at those weapons. He wasn't pretending not to see them. He wasn't putting on a performance of not being afraid, which is what most people do when they're afraid and trying to project calm. You can always tell. The performance has a quality to it, an edge of control, like someone holding very still so they don't spill something. Calder just looked at the weapons, and the fear either wasn't there or had been so completely metabolized into something else that it produced the same result. And he looked at them the way you look at weather, as a relevant fact about the current environment that didn't particularly change what you were doing. I want to be transparent about my position. I was not on the station. I was on the Gravith, monitoring the internal communication feeds from the boarding party and feeding sensor data to Warlord Vorgon's tactical team. So what I know of the corridor events comes from those feeds, audio, visual, biosensor data from the Warlord's suit, and from later accounts given by the Honor Guard members. I am also no longer in service to the Vorganthi Directorate. This context is relevant. I've been asked to speak about the science of what we were seeing, because I think there's a tendency in popular accounts to make the corridor incident either more mystical or more simple than it actually was. So let me tell you what our biosensors showed. The human's heart rate throughout the 7-minute standoff averaged 88 beats per minute. I looked this up afterward. Normal resting human heart rate is 60 to 100, with the average for a healthy adult around 70. His was slightly elevated, which is consistent with a stressful situation, but it was not the pattern you see in acute fear response. Acute fear in humans produces a much more dramatic spike. We've studied this extensively in combat modeling, followed by elevated plateau, followed by drop as either the threat resolves or the organism habituates to the threat level. He didn't spike, he just climbed slowly to a slightly elevated level and stayed there. His respiration rate was controlled. Deliberately controlled, our analysis suggested, in the pattern associated with voluntary breath regulation rather than normal at-rest breathing. His cortisol levels, to the extent our sensors could detect them through standard armor, showed the expected stress response. He was absolutely feeling it. There was no indication that he was physiologically unusual in any way. He was just managing it, processing it, and continuing to function through it. Our models at the time did not really account for this. We had extensive data on human physiological responses to threat, gathered over the years of our monitoring of the outer rim corridors. The models all suggested that at the threat level the boarding party represented, the vast majority of humans, well over 90%, would exhibit behaviors consistent with surrender, retreat, or active submission within the first 2 to 3 minutes. Our models were wrong. I raised this with Subcommander Vrethak at approximately the 4-minute mark. I said, "This one isn't following the pattern." He said, "I can see that." I said, "The Warlord may need to know." He said, "The Warlord is aware." And I looked at the feed from the corridor again, and I saw the Warlord's bio-readings, which I also had access to, because everything talks to everything on a Gravith-class flagship, and his heart rate, which had been absolutely stable since we arrived, had gone up. Not a spike, not acute fear, nothing like that. Just up a little. Curious. Calder, this is Embeki Harrington. I need you to hear this. I've been on the comm with the Oreth's commission for the last 6 minutes. I've been on the comm with UEDC command for the last 4. I've been on the comm with 3 members of the Corridor Security Council trying to get anyone, to have authority over this situation before it becomes something we can't walk back from. Here's what I need you to know. I don't have backup coming. Not in time. Our fleet assets are 14 minutes out minimum, and that's if they departed the moment the alert went out, which they did, and they're still 14 minutes out. I'm not telling you to do anything you're not already doing. I'm telling you this because I think you have a right to know the full situation. I'm also, and I want this on the record, I'm also telling you that if you decide that discretion is the better part of valor here and you want to step back and let them through, I will back that decision. Nobody on this station is going to fault you for it. What you've done already, what you've done for the last 7 minutes, is something. But if you're planning to hold that line, you should know you're holding it alone until the fleet gets there. Over. Calder's response, recorded in station log. 14 minutes, copy that. I can do 14 minutes. Over and out. Chapter 12, he said it out loud. Witness account, Chief Petty Officer Tam Rezo-Duya. His comm was on open channel. I don't know if he meant it to be, or if he just didn't think about it, or if, and I've started to think this is the most likely explanation. He knew it was on open channel and said it anyway because he meant it to be heard. I can do 14 minutes. Said the same way he said everything, level. Like a statement of observable fact. And we all saw, the 4 of us at that checkpoint and the secondary team behind us, and based on the footage reviews the honor guard and several of the Vorganthi soldiers too, the Warlord's head tilt. It's hard to describe to someone who hasn't seen it. The Vorganthi head tilt is not like a human head tilt. They're larger, the musculature is different, the angle of it is different. But functionally it does the same thing. It's the physical expression of someone who has just heard something that requires a slight recalibration. And then Vorgan said something, not on his comm, out loud in the corridor directed at Calder. He said, and this is translated, the translation has been verified by multiple xenolinguistics experts because it matters, he said. You know you cannot stop us. And Calder said, yes. Then what are you doing? And Calder said, and this is the line, the one that ends up on everything, the one that I have heard 1,000 times since that day, and that still does something to me every single time, Calder said. My job. Part 4, the moment. Chapter 13, 12 minutes in. Witness account, Ensign Dara Okonkwo Walsh. I want to tell you what it looked like from 50 meters back, because the close-up footage from the checkpoint cameras is the most famous, but there's a wider shot from the junction camera that I think tells a slightly different story. From that distance, Calder was small. I mean objectively small against everything in front of him. The Warlord alone was roughly double his height in that armor, and the corridor was full wall-to-wall and back into the docking ring with Vorganthi soldiers, 42 of them, 48 with the honor guard, plus Vorgan. And Calder was one person, standing in the middle of the corridor, and from 50 meters back what that looked like it looked like someone had made a mistake. Like someone had accidentally walked into a situation they shouldn't be in, except that he was so clearly not accidentally there, so clearly so deliberately there, that the mistake feeling didn't stick. What it actually looked like, if I'm honest, and I've struggled to find the right words for this, and I think about it a lot, it looked like a principle. It looked like something abstract made physically present. Like the concept of there is a line here, rendered in human form and put in the middle of that corridor. At 12 minutes, Vorgan tried something new. He started talking, not to Calder, to his soldiers, in Vorganthi, which none of us spoke at that fluency level, though I caught maybe 40% of it. He was saying something about precedent, about what it would mean to allow this delay, about the optics of 48 Vorganthi warriors standing in a corridor being held up by one human. He was, I realized, starting to feel it. Not the strategic pressure, not a military calculation, something more personal than that. He was starting to feel the 48 pairs of eyes on him, and the one pair of human eyes across the corridor, and the growing gap between how this was supposed to go and how it was actually going. He was starting to feel, I think, that if he ended this the easy way, which was to simply walk through Calder, in whatever sense, walk through, meant in that context, it might have a certain finality to it, But it would also mean that this human, this one ordinary human, had made him feel something he'd forgotten he was capable of feeling. The need to justify himself. And for Drathek Vorgon, I suspect that was unfamiliar. Chapter 14, the armor comes off. Witness account, Chief Petty Officer Tam Rezo Duya. I don't know who was more surprised, us or his own people. 13 minutes in, which I know because I'd been watching the clock, we were doing the math on the fleet's ETA constantly. Vorgon reached up and did something with the fastening system on his chest plate. The Grathkel armor has a complex locking system. It's not something you do in the field. It's a deliberate action that requires several separate steps. He started doing the steps. The honor guard made a sound. Not words, a sound. It was the first time any of the Vorganthi had made an uncontrolled vocalization, and the sound they made was something I could only describe as a held breath, converted to sound. A sharp intake that came out as something between a gasp and a question. The officers behind the guard started talking. Fast. In the clipped, formal Vorganthi command register that I couldn't parse quickly enough to follow. Vorgon said something back to them, short, sharp. The kind of sentence structure that means I'm aware of what I'm doing and I don't want to hear about it. And he kept going. The chest plate came off first. Then the shoulder assemblies. Then the upper arm guards, which lock to the shoulder assemblies in a way that requires rotating them and then pulling. And he did this with the practiced ease of someone who'd put on and taken off this armor so many times that the sequence was automatic. Underneath the armor, Vorgon he was still enormous. This is important to understand. The armor doesn't make Vorganthi large, they're large already. The armor amplifies what's already there. Without it, he was still well over 9 feet, still massively built in the way that's characteristic of the Vorganthi military subspecies, with that distinctive dark reddish cast to their skin and the wide, heavy-boned facial structure. But he was present in a different way without the armor. More real somehow, more like a person and less like an apparatus. He set the armor to the side. One of his honor guards stepped forward and received it, holding it with visible discomfort because clearly this was not standard protocol, and he walked forward. Toward Calder. Witness account, Ensign Dara Akonkwa Walsh. He stopped 2 feet in front of him. I've counted it in the footage. 2 feet, maybe a little less. Enough that Calder had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact, and I watched him do that, watched him make that small adjustment without any of the body language that usually accompanies it. No stepping back, no widening of stance, no unconscious preparation for flight. Just tilted his head, kept looking. Vorgon looked down at him for a long time. Then he said in Vorganthi, slowly enough that even I caught most of it at the time, he said, "Tell me your name." And Calder said, "Calder, Marcus Calder, Private First Class, UEDC. Witness account, Chief Petty Officer Tam Rezo Duya. They left. That's the part that's hardest to write because it's the part that still doesn't seem entirely real, even though I was there. Even though I saw it. Even though I have watched the footage 50, 60, 100 times and every single time it ends the same way. They left. 48 Vorganthi soldiers, 6 officers, and 1 Supreme Warlord turned around and walked back through Docking Ring C and reboarded their boarding vessels and went back to the Gravith. The whole withdrawal took about 8 minutes. They moved with the same practiced military precision. They'd arrived with no chaos, no disorder, except in the completely opposite direction. Our fleet arrived at 13 minutes and 51 seconds, 4 seconds after Vorgon had already given the return order. 4 seconds. I stood at that checkpoint until the last Vorganthi soldier was out of the corridor and the dock doors sealed behind them. Then I sat down on the floor because my legs had decided they were done. Calder was still standing. I looked at him, he looked at me. He said, "Fleet made good time." I said, "Calder, they were already going." He looked at the sealed dock doors. Something moved across his face, not relief exactly. It was more complicated than relief. It was the look of someone who has been carrying something extremely heavy for a sustained period of time and has just set it down and is now experiencing the absence of it and isn't quite sure how to feel about the absence. He said, "Huh." Then he sat down on the floor next to me. After a while he said, "Can somebody radio in for coffee? My cup went cold." Chapter 18, The Vorganthi Fleet's Departure. The Gravith and its escort fleet began fold space preparation at 8:56 station time, approximately 40 minutes after the corridor incident concluded. Before departing, Warlord Vorgon transmitted a single message to my command station, not on the emergency broadcast frequency he'd used before, on the standard diplomatic channel with appropriate protocol headers. It said, "Your soldier Calder held a line. That is noted in the Gravith campaign log. I've been in this service for 22 years. I've received a lot of communications. I've never received anything quite like that." I responded formally through the proper channels as protocol required and thanked him for the communication. He didn't reply. They folded out of the corridor at 9:01. My tactical officer, Lieutenant Parks, watched the fold signature dissipate on the sensor display and then turned around and said, "That actually just happened." I said, "Write it up." He said, "Yes, ma'am. What do I even call the incident report?" I thought about it for a moment. I said, "Call it what it was, a checkpoint hold. Guard member designated H1. I have been in the Warlord's honor guard for 11 years. I have been with him on 14 campaigns. I have watched him negotiate with heads of state. I have watched him face down armed fleets. I have watched him enter rooms where everyone in the room wanted him dead and simply expect to leave and leave. I have never seen him remove his armor. Not in the field, not in any confrontation, in any corridor on any world. The armor it is not just protection. You have to understand our culture to understand this. The Grathkel is a statement. It is the physical declaration of a Vorganthi commander's absolute authority in a given space. To remove it is complex. It is not weakness. It cannot be weakness because Warlord Vorgon cannot afford weakness and has not survived this long by misunderstanding what the symbols mean. But I did not understand why he did it at the time. I have thought about it a great deal since. My best understanding is, he wanted the human to see him. Not the armor him. Because the armor was talking to a wall, and he'd met something that made him want to try a different conversation. Guard member designated H2. What I remember is the way the human stood. We see many beings try to hold their ground against us. It is a common response. We represent an overwhelming force, and some beings have the instinct to stand firm even when standing firm is irrational. Most of them, the body betrays it. The stillness is a performance of stillness. Underneath it, they are shaking, in whatever way their physiology does shaking. This human was not performing stillness. He was just still. I've spent a long time trying to understand the difference because it mattered to me professionally. I think the difference is this. Performance of stillness is stillness imposed on a frightened body. Real stillness, his kind of stillness, is when the fear exists and has been incorporated into the body's functional state instead of fighting it. He was afraid. His vital readings confirmed this, but the fear was not fighting him. It was just another thing he was carrying. I have not seen that many times in any species. Guard member designated H3. The Warlord asked me about it. Afterward, on the ship, he asked me what I had seen. I told him I saw a human hold a line. He said, "Yes, and..." I said, "I do not know what else." He said, "Think longer." I thought longer. And then I said, "I saw a human hold a line knowing he could not hold it. And I think that is a different thing than holding a line you think you can hold." The Warlord was quiet for a while. 2 days after it happened, when the adrenaline had fully cleared and everyone on the station had processed it at least a little, and the relay network clips were already spreading, and we were starting to get communication requests from journalists and military historians and xenological research teams who wanted to come to Tethys 9 and do documentaries. 2 days after all of that started, I found Calder in the mess hall. Same table, same position, boot on the table, data pad in hand. He had actual coffee this time. Someone had found a real import shipment somewhere. It happened occasionally, and real coffee was being shared around in small cups like something precious, which it was. I sat down across from him. I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "Fine." I said, "The station commander put you in for a commendation." He said, I said, "Also, you're going to have to do about 40 media interviews." He made a face. This was, of all the things he'd reacted to in the past several days, the clearest reaction I'd seen from him. I said, I'm serious. He said, I know. We were quiet for a bit. I drank my coffee. He read his data pad for a while, the old novel, I think. The same one he'd been working through for weeks. Then he said, not looking up from the page, "Can I ask you something?" I said, sure. He said, would you have done it if I hadn't been there? I thought about it, honestly, the way he deserved an honest answer. I said, I don't know. He nodded like that was what he expected. I said, would you have? If you'd known from the beginning how it was going to go, all 14 minutes, would you still have stepped out? He was quiet for long enough that I thought he might not answer. Then he said, I don't think the part about how it was going to go is the part that matters. He turned a page. I just think somebody had to be standing there, at that point, in that moment, and I was the person standing there. He finally looked up. There was something in his expression that I couldn't quite read, not pride, not satisfaction, nothing that dramatic. More like recognition of something simple. He said, I think that's most of what any of us are doing most of the time, being the person standing at the point where something needs standing at. He looked back at his data pad. Anyway, the coffee's good today. The committee convened within 72 hours of the incident. I'll be direct about what happened in that room, because the official record is somewhat sanitized, and I think the public record deserves more candor than the official one. What happened in that room was, every delegation arrived with a prepared position, and every prepared position was essentially irrelevant by the end of the first hour, because the conversation had shifted onto ground that none of the prepared positions had anticipated. The Vorganthi delegation, not Vorgan himself, he sent a senior diplomat named Vrethal, arrived with what I initially expected to be a defensive posture. Justification for the corridor entry, legal arguments about the Orethes Accord interpretations, possibly some form of territorial counterclaim. Instead, Vrethal opened by stating, and this is in the record, that the Directorate acknowledged the unauthorized corridor entry and the violation of multiple neutral zone protocols, and was prepared to accept the committee's standard censure process, pay any applicable transit penalties, and formally request the proper documentation for future access to Tethys 9. The room was quiet for a moment. I asked, as diplomatically as I could, whether the Directorate had any additional remarks. Vrethal said, the Directorate also requests that the record note, formally, that Private First Class Marcus Calder of the United Earth Defense Corps conducted himself with honor in the discharge of his duty. The Warlord considered it worth stating for the record. The UEDC representative, a senior admiral who'd been preparing a very different kind of statement, looked at her notes, then at Vrethal, then at me. I said, the committee so notes. It would be an overstatement to say that one corridor incident transformed the relationship between humanity and the Vorganthi Directorate. It would also be an understatement to say it didn't matter. What changed in the months following the Tethys 9 incident was not dramatic enough to make most headlines. There were no treaties signed, no formal alliance announcements, no gestures of outright friendship from a culture that doesn't really do friendship in the political sense. What changed was more granular than that. More interesting in some ways. The Vorganthi began, for the first time in recorded diplomatic history, initiating standard neutral zone protocol communications before entering disputed corridors. Not because they were legally required to, the enforcement mechanisms for that have always been weak, but because they chose to. 3 separate Vorganthi military academic institutions requested access to UEDC training documentation. The specific areas of interest cited were individual soldier decision-making frameworks, protocols for outnumbered personnel in confrontation situations, and what the requests termed the methodology of positional commitment. Supreme Warlord Vorgan, in a speech delivered to Directorate Military Command approximately 4 months after the incident, a speech that was monitored and recorded in full by our Signals Corps, made reference to the Tethys 9 incident once briefly, without using names. He said, in the Tethys corridor, we encountered something the fleet records describe as an obstacle, and I will tell you is more accurately described as a lesson. There is a kind of strength that our models have not adequately accounted for. We are accounting for it now. He moved on to other subjects. The speech was 40 minutes long. But he'd said it. Witness account, Ensign Dara Okonkwo Walsh. He was embarrassed by the ceremony. I say this not to diminish it. The UEDC Medal of Exceptional Conduct is not something that gets given out every cycle, and the commanding general who flew out to Tethys-9 to present it clearly felt that the occasion warranted the trip. The whole garrison was assembled. There were people who'd served in other postings who asked to be transferred to Tethys-9 temporarily just to be present for it. Calder stood at attention for the whole thing, and his face was doing something extremely interesting throughout. It was the face of someone who is genuinely uncomfortable with attention, and is being very polite about tolerating a lot of it. The general gave a speech. It was a good speech. It talked about what it meant to hold a line, what it meant to represent something larger than yourself, what it meant to be the kind of person who steps forward instead of back when it would be vastly more reasonable to step back. Calder stood there and let the speech happen to him. After the medal was pinned, the general asked him if he had any remarks. Calder said, "No, sir, thank you for the medal." The general laughed. The whole assembled garrison laughed, the good kind of laugh, the kind that eases something. Then Calder said, and this wasn't in his prepared remarks because he didn't have prepared remarks because he'd refused to write any, "I want to say, with respect, I'm not sure I did anything exceptional. I think I just did the next thing. I was standing there and the situation needed someone standing there and I was already standing. The rest kind of just followed." He paused, looked out at the assembled personnel, the civilians who'd gathered in the docking rings above, the various non-human station staff who'd clustered near the entrances. "I keep trying to write about it and it keeps coming out wrong. Everyone wants me to describe it in a certain way. The interviews, the debriefs, the generals, people who called about some kind of documentary project. They all have an idea of the story before I tell it, and they want me to fit my account to that shape. I understand why. It's a good shape. It has the right beats. But it doesn't feel accurate to what it actually was. What it actually was, I was standing at a checkpoint. An unauthorized boarding party came through the dock doors. I'd been trained for unauthorized boarding responses. The training says you state your position, you establish the legal framework, you hold the point until backup arrives or the situation resolves. I followed the training. I was afraid the whole time. I want to put that in the record clearly, because I think there's a version of this that edits the fear out, and the fear is kind of the whole point. I was afraid, and I knew perfectly well that I was in a situation I couldn't actually control or resolve, and I also knew that leaving the point meant leaving it. And leaving the point when you're the person standing at the point it's not an option. Not because of heroism, just because of what it would mean, about what the point is, about what it means to be standing somewhere. I don't think I'm special. I genuinely don't. I think I was the person in the position, and the position required doing a thing, and I did the thing. I think about the Warlord taking his armor off, though. I keep coming back to that. Because that was a choice that I don't entirely understand yet, and I find I want to understand it. Not because of what it means for the strategic situation or the diplomatic implications or any of the things the debriefs have focused on. Just because of what it says about the universe. That something like that can happen. That something rigid and certain and armored, in every sense, can encounter something and choose to put the armor down. I think that's worth noting. Anyway, I'm nearly done with this novel. The coffee's still good. I've given a version of this talk about a dozen times now, and every time the question I get most frequently from the audience is some version of, why did it work? It's a good question. It's not a simple question. The instinct is to make it about Calder specifically. To attribute the outcome to some particular quality, he had exceptional nerve, unusual physiological calm, military training that went above and beyond what the standard program provides. And Calder does have qualities worth discussing. But I don't think the explanation lives primarily there. I think the explanation lives in something about the structure of what he did. We spend a lot of time in interspecies relations thinking about power, about how power is distributed, displayed, signaled, respected. We've gotten quite sophisticated about it. Our diplomatic corps has extensive modeling of how different species interpret and respond to power signals, and that modeling is genuinely useful. What the Tethys-9 incident suggests to me, and this is where my academic peers sometimes push back, is that there's a signal we've been underweighting in that modeling. The signal of conviction that exists independent of capability. Vorgon understood power. He understood it the way you understand something you've spent 37 years building and using. He knew exactly how much power he had in that corridor and how much Calder had, and what the ratio between those numbers meant. What he encountered, and what he didn't have a clean framework for, was a being who held a position not because they could hold it, but because the position needed holding. These are different. They look similar from the outside sometimes, but they're different. I will hold this because I am strong enough to hold it is a calculation. It can be answered with a counter-calculation. I will hold this because it needs holding is a statement about the nature of something. It doesn't have a counter-argument. You can remove the person making the statement. The statement itself doesn't go anywhere. I think Vorgon, and this is interpretation, I'll acknowledge that, I think Vorgon recognized that distinction. And I think he found, in recognizing it, something that his 37 years of conquest hadn't previously required him to look at directly. A kind of strength that his models hadn't accounted for. He was accounting for it now. The Tethys 9 corridor incident was declassified for public archive access 3 years after it occurred, following a review by the Joint Udkorethes Commission Historical Panel. The incident file contains 2,847 individual documents, sensor logs, testimony transcripts, communication records, analysis reports, academic papers, news archive references, and the recovered personal log of Private First Class Marcus Calder. We have compiled them here in their current form. A few final notes for the archive record. Marcus Calder continued his service in the UEDC for 6 more years, completing 3 additional postings before accepting a position with the Neutral Zone Security Commission, where he currently serves as a Senior Checkpoint Protocols Advisor. He has given 43 interviews about the Tethys 9 incident. He consistently describes himself as just the person who was standing there. He still reads old novels on his data pad. Supreme Warlord Drathek Vorgon remains in command of the Vorganthi Directorate. The Directorate has not conducted an unauthorized entry into any neutral corridor since the Tethys 9 incident. This is, by any historical measure, unprecedented. Diplomatic scholars continue to debate the cause. LT Commander Saoirse Mbeki Harrington was promoted to full commander 8 months after the incident. She remains at Tethys 9 by choice. She has declined 3 transfer offers and commands the station to this day. Ensign Dara Okonkwo Walsh transferred to the Xenobiological Research Division 6 months after the incident, citing the events of that day as formative in redirecting her professional interests. She is currently completing a doctoral study in interspecies behavioral dynamics. Chief Petty Officer Tam Ray-Zoduya finished his tour at Tethys 9 and is currently serving at a station near the Dren border. He has reportedly told the story of the checkpoint standoff exactly once in the years since, to a new soldier in his unit who was expressing doubt about whether individual actions in large-scale situations actually mattered. He told the story. He didn't editorialize, he let it speak for itself. The interviewer asked Veloth Isan-Mar, near the end of their conversation, what she thought the Tethys 9 incident ultimately meant for the broader question of humanity's place in the galactic order. Veloth Isan-Mar was quiet for a moment. She was a very old woman. The Marathi live long, longer than humans by a considerable measure, and she'd been in diplomatic service for what humans would measure as about 90 years. She'd seen things. She had context that very few beings had. She said, "You know, when humans first began moving through the outer corridors, when they first arrived in what we think of as galactic space, there were many conversations among the older species about what to make of them. They were small," she said. Small and new and comparatively fragile. Their technology was competent, developing, not remarkable by the standards of species that had been spacefaring for centuries. And there were those who felt they were not serious, that they were a novelty, something that would eventually find its level, which was somewhere in the comfortable middle, not powerful enough to threaten anyone, not weak enough to be absorbed by anyone. A small species doing small things in the space between more consequential stories. She paused. "And then there are moments," she said, "when the universe shows you what something is made of, not in the big moments." Not in the battles and the treaty signings and the declarations and the spectacular events that go into the formal history books. In the small moments, a corridor, a checkpoint, a person standing somewhere. And you realize that your assessment was incomplete. The interviewer asked, "Is that what Tethys 9 was, a reassessment?" Veloth Isanmar smiled. She said the Vorganthi have a word, Grelket. It means small, inconsequential, not worth serious attention. She said Warlord Vorgan called the human Grelket when he first saw him. She said he has not used that word in any recorded communication since.